The rush hour intersection was a nightmare, a suffocating sea of steel and smog. Deep within the gridlock, an ambulance was trapped, its siren a desperate, heart-wrenching wail for help. Ethan Cole, a struggling single dad, saw the emergency and felt the weight of a life on the line. Ignoring his manager's furious threats and the company's rigid protocols, he bravely stepped into the chaos to clear a path. The ambulance roared through, but 5 minutes later, Ethan was fired on the spot. He lost his livelihood, but he had no idea whose powerful life he had just saved. Ethan Cole was a man of quiet strength, a man whose silence was often mistaken for indifference. At 38, his world had shrunk to a very small, very precious circle. It revolved entirely around one person, his 6-year-old son, Max. Every decision Ethan made, every hour of overtime he pulled, and every sacrifice he endured was for the boy with the messy brown hair and the wide, inquisitive eyes. Lately, life had been testing Ethan's limits. The rent on their small apartment had just increased, and the car's transmission was beginning to slip, a rhythmic grinding that sounded like debt collecting its interest. Right now, as the sun began to dip behind the jagged skyline of the city, Max was sitting on the cold stone steps of his after-school art class. He was swinging his legs, a small sketch pad in his lap, waiting for his hero to pick him up. Ethan hated being late. He knew the hollow feeling of a child being the last one left behind in a darkening hallway. He had promised Max they would get ice cream tonight, a small reward for a week of hard work. Ethan's current job was a far cry from his former glory. He was a temporary safety coordinator for a massive multi-million-dollar road expansion project at the city's busiest crossing. It was a position born out of crushing necessity, not passion. Years ago, Ethan hadn't been wearing a dusty orange vest. He had been a lead emergency traffic dispatcher, a high-stakes logistics specialist who coordinated responses to multi-car pileups and natural disasters. He was the best in the business, a man who could see a city's gridlock like a chess master sees a board. But everything changed after a rainy Tuesday 4 years ago. A family tragedy, a car accident that took his wife, had left him as a solo parent. The high-stress, 24-hour shifts of emergency dispatch were no longer an option. He needed to be a father first. He traded the adrenaline of saving lives for the stability of a 9-to-5 construction gig. He needed a predictable schedule. He needed to be home for bedtime stories and morning cereal. The construction site today was a chaotic symphony of frustration. Orange cones littered the asphalt like landmines, and the heat rising from the fresh blacktop made the air shimmer with tension. The intersection of 5th and Main was the city's main artery, and right now it was suffering a massive stroke. The company handbook, a thick laminated binder that Ethan kept in his back pocket, was clear. It was printed in bold, unforgiving black letters. Section 4.2. Under no circumstances shall a safety officer leave their designated station or interfere with established traffic flow patterns. Deviating from the project flow plan without direct supervisor approval is grounds for immediate termination. Ethan's manager, a man named Miller, was the living embodiment of those rules. Miller was a man who measured success in centimeters and seconds. He didn't care about the people sitting in their idling cars. He cared about project milestones, liquidated damages, and contract penalties. Miller had spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder by being the most rigid man in the room. To Miller, a delay wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a personal insult to his authority. Earlier that day, Miller had cornered Ethan. "I see you looking at that watch, Cole. If you sneak off 1 minute early to pick up your kid again, don't bother coming back. We have a concrete pour scheduled for 5:15, and I need everybody on the line. No excuses." Ethan had merely nodded, swallowing his pride for the sake of his paycheck. Then the sound started. At first, it was just a distant mechanical hum, easily drowned out by the jackhammers and the grumbling of heavy engines. But within seconds, it transformed. It became a piercing, rhythmic scream that sliced through the afternoon smog. An ambulance. Ethan stood frozen at his post, his hand gripping his plastic stop sign. He watched as 2 massive cement mixers, following the site flow dictated by Miller, moved forward, effectively sealing the only available gap in the intersection. Behind them, the white and red box of the ambulance was visible, its lights flashing uselessly against the backs of the unmoving trucks. Ethan saw the ambulance driver's face through the windshield. A young man, pale with sweat, his jaw set in a grimace of pure panic. The driver was pounding his fist on the steering wheel, begging for a hole that didn't exist. Most people in the crowd just heard a loud noise. They saw a delay. But Ethan heard the story hidden in the siren. His old training kicked in like a dormant reflex. He knew the difference between a transfer siren, used for moving stable patients, and a code red pulse. This was a life-is-fading siren. The pitch was higher, the intervals shorter, the urgency almost physical. The ambulance was vibrating with the need to move, yet it was boxed in by a system that valued asphalt over blood. Ethan looked at his radio. He could hear Miller's voice barking orders about a concrete pour on the north side. Miller was focused on the deadline, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding 20 feet away. Ethan reached into his pocket and touched the small, worn photo of Max. He thought about the weight of a single life. He thought about a family out there, perhaps just like his, waiting for a phone call that would either bring relief or destroy their world. He thought about the person inside that ambulance, someone's mother, someone's child, someone's everything. The decision didn't take minutes. It didn't even take seconds. It happened in the microscopic space between two heartbeats. Ethan felt a strange, icy calm wash over him, the kind of clarity he hadn't felt since his dispatch days. He knew the rules. He knew Miller was watching from the elevated trailer with binoculars. He knew that by stepping out, he was signing his own pink slip. He knew his bank account was nearly empty and the rent was due in 3 days. But he also knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if he stayed behind that orange barrier, the person in that ambulance would never see the sunset. He took a step, then another. He moved past the do not cross line, leaving the safety of the sidewalk and entering the heart of the mechanical beast. Ethan didn't just walk into the traffic, he commanded it. The moment his boots hit the active lane, his posture changed. He wasn't a construction worker anymore. He was the master of the grid. He used the sharp, authoritative hand signals of a professional emergency coordinator, movements that were impossible to ignore. He pointed his finger directly at the driver of the first cement mixer, locking eyes with him, and signaled a hard, immediate left into the restricted construction zone. "Move it! Now!" Ethan shouted over the roar of the engines. The truck driver gasped, seeing the intensity in Ethan's eyes, and swung the massive wheel. The driver hesitated, looking toward Miller's trailer, but Ethan's authority was magnetic. With a sharp whistle and a flat palm gesture, Ethan blocked a line of oncoming SUVs that were trying to cheat the light. He was weaving between moving bumpers, a lone figure in a faded high-visibility vest standing against a sea of angry steel. A gap appeared. It was narrow, jagged, and lined with sharp equipment, but it was a lifeline. Ethan turned to the ambulance and made a sweeping, "come forward" motion. The driver's eyes widened in relief. The siren changed pitch, a short, grateful chirp, and the massive vehicle lunged into the opening, its tires screeching on the hot pavement. As it roared past Ethan, the wind of its passage ruffled his vest. For a split second, he saw a medic in the back, hunched over a patient, performing chest compressions with a rhythmic, desperate intensity. The medic glanced up, their eyes meeting Ethan's for a fleeting second, a look of profound, silent gratitude. Ethan watched the ambulance go, weaving through the newly opened path until its red lights vanished over the crest of the hill. He felt a brief, flickering moment of pride. He had done it. The path was clear. Then the world came crashing back in. The silence that followed was more deafening than the sirens. The traffic stopped. The jackhammers died down. Every worker on the site was staring at Ethan. And then came the sound of heavy boots hitting the metal stairs of the supervisor's trailer. "Cole!" Miller wasn't just walking, he was charging. His face was a deep, bruised purple, his veins standing out like cords on his neck. He was screaming before his feet even touched the gravel. "What the hell was that? Who gave you the authority to break the flow? You just halted a 3-vessel pour. Do you have any idea what 10 minutes of idle time costs this company? The concrete is going to start setting in the drums." Ethan stood his ground, his voice low, steady, and devoid of the fear Miller expected. There was a life in that ambulance, Miller. A code red. The company handbook doesn't cover a heart stopping in the middle of an intersection. I did your job for you. I kept this site from becoming a crime scene. You did nothing but cost me money, Miller spat, his hot breath smelling of stale coffee. He reached out and, with a violent tug, ripped the safety badge and the radio from Ethan's vest, tearing the fabric. You're done. You're fired. Gross negligence, willful endangerment of the site, and direct insubordination. Don't bother coming back for your gear. We'll mail your final check, minus the damages for the delay. Get off my site, now! The other workers, men Ethan had shared coffee with for months, looked away. They looked at their boots, at the sky, at their shovels. They knew Ethan was right. They knew he was a hero. But they also knew that rent was due and Miller was a vindictive man. They couldn't afford to be heroes. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't plead for his job. He knew the type of man Miller was. There was no reasoning with a soul made of spreadsheets. He simply took off his hard hat and placed it carefully, almost reverently, on the yellow line of the road. He picked up his lunch cooler and started the long walk toward the parking lot. His hands were shaking, not from regret, but from the sudden, cold realization of his new reality. He was a single father. He had no job. He had no savings. He had a 6-year-old boy who thought his dad was invincible. As he walked, he passed a group of commuters who had watched the whole thing. One woman reached out as if to say something, but Ethan just kept his head down. He couldn't deal with sympathy right now. He needed a miracle. He sat in his old rattling truck for a long time, staring at the dust on the steering wheel. He picked up his phone to call Max's teacher. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Gable. I'm going to be a little late. There was an incident at work. Please tell Max I'm coming. Tell him I'm coming as fast as I can." As he drove through the city, the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the dashboard. Ethan felt the crushing weight of his choice. In the movies, doing the right thing ends in a round of applause. In the real world, it often ends in a quiet house, a cold dinner, and the fear of what tomorrow will bring. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. An unknown number, a local area code. He ignored it. He assumed it was a bill collector or a telemarketer. He wasn't in the mood to explain his life to a stranger. He just wanted to get to Max. He wanted to feel those small arms around his neck and forget, for just an hour, that he was unemployed. He didn't know that miles away, in the gleaming, sterile white halls of the City Memorial Hospital, his name was being whispered like a prayer. He didn't know that the woman inside that ambulance wasn't just a random patient. She was the owner of the very company that had just thrown him away. If you believe that doing the right thing is worth the cost, hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment the tables turn. The ambulance didn't just arrive at the hospital. It erupted into the loading bay. Female, 52, acute stroke symptoms. Last known well was 20 minutes ago. "We are inside the golden hour," the lead medic shouted as they slid the gurney out. The patient was Evelyn Vance. To the financial world, she was a titan, the CEO of Vance Global Infrastructure, a woman who had built half the bridges in the country. She was a powerhouse, a visionary, and a workaholic who had pushed herself until her body finally rebelled. To the doctors, she was currently just a woman whose brain was being starved of oxygen by the second. She was rushed into the neurotrauma suite. Her personal assistant Sarah stood in the waiting room, her knuckles white as she gripped Evelyn's leather briefcase. Sarah was a woman of logic and data, and she had been watching the clock in the ambulance. She knew the math. They had been stuck at 5th and Main. The GPS had turned red. The driver had said they were boxed in. By all accounts, Evelyn Vance should have arrived at the hospital brain dead. When the lead surgeon finally emerged 3 hours later, he was exhausted but smiling. "She's stable," he said, taking off his mask. "She's a lucky woman. If she had arrived even 3 minutes later, the damage would have been catastrophic and permanent. Whoever cleared that path for you gave her a second life." Sarah didn't wait. She went straight to the hospital's security and liaison office. She used her influence to pull the dash cam footage from the ambulance. She needed to see how they had made it through. On the grainy high-definition screen, the chaos of the intersection was visible. It looked like a total deadlock. Then she saw him, a lone figure in a faded, slightly oversized orange vest. He moved with a strange magnetic confidence. He didn't look like a construction worker. He looked like a general. She watched him dive into traffic, saw the way he maneuvered the heavy trucks like they were toys. He wasn't just clearing a path. He was orchestrating a miracle in the middle of a nightmare. Evelyn Vance woke up late that evening. Her speech was slightly slurred, her right side weak, but her mind, that legendary piercing mind, was fully present. She looked at Sarah. "Who?" she whispered. "Who opened the gate?" Sarah leaned in close. "We're finding him, Evelyn. He was a safety coordinator at the Phase 4 site, the intersection at 5th and Main." The search was relentless. Evelyn Vance didn't just run a company. She owned the entire development contract for the city's road expansion. She had Sarah call the head of the construction firm, the man who was Miller's boss. "I want the name of the man who saved my life today at 5:15 p.m., Evelyn commanded from her hospital bed, her voice gaining strength with every word. There was a long, awkward pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Vance, we looked into that incident. That was a worker named Ethan Cole, but I have to be honest, he actually caused a major disruption. Our site supervisor, Miller, reported that Cole violated multiple safety protocols and halted the concrete pour. We've already taken care of it. He was terminated, effective immediately to maintain our standards." Evelyn's eyes, usually a calm blue, flashed with a cold, predatory fire. "You fired him for saving my life?" The silence on the other end was absolute. You could almost hear the executive's heart stop through the phone. "Listen to me very carefully," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You find Ethan Cole. You find out where he lives, what he needs, and why he was the only man on that site with enough courage to do the right thing, and you bring him to me. If he isn't in this room by tomorrow morning, your contract with Vance Global won't just be canceled, it will be erased from history." While Ethan was at home, sitting at his small kitchen table, staring at a bowl of cold mac and cheese he was too tired to eat, a black SUV was pulling into the gravel lot of the construction site. Corporate investigators, sent directly by Evelyn Vance, were opening the black box of the company's internal records. They weren't looking at the delay. They were looking at Miller's logs. They were looking at a culture that prioritized a project milestone over a human heartbeat. In the hospital, Evelyn looked at a still frame from the dashcam footage. She saw Ethan's face, not a look of anger or rebellion, but one of deep, quiet compassion. He had looked at that ambulance and seen a human being, not a disruption. "Sarah," Evelyn said, looking out at the city lights, "send a car to his address. Don't call first. Just go. And tell the board of directors I want an emergency meeting at 9 a.m. We aren't just changing a protocol. We're changing the soul of this company." Ethan was in the middle of tucking Max into bed, whispering a story about a brave knight who fought a dragon, when a pair of bright LED headlights swept across his living room wall. He felt a sharp jolt of anxiety. Is this Miller? Is he coming here to threaten me because I haven't turned in my vest? He kissed Max on the forehead and stepped out onto the porch. He didn't find a construction truck. He found a sleek black executive vehicle. Sarah stepped out, looking at the modest, slightly weathered house. "Mr. Cole, my name is Sarah. I'm the chief of staff for Evelyn Vance. She would like to speak with you." Ethan was defensive, his voice weary. "Look, if this is about the traffic delay, I've already been fired. I don't have anything else to give you." "Ethan," Sarah said, her voice softening, "it's not about the traffic. It's about the fact that Evelyn Vance is alive because of you. Please, she's waiting." An hour later, Ethan walked into the luxury recovery suite at the hospital. He felt out of place in his work boots and flannel shirt, standing on the polished marble floors. He saw the woman from the ambulance. She looked different now, vulnerable but still radiating a quiet power. "You're the one," Evelyn said, her voice steady. She reached out a hand, and Ethan took it. Her grip was firm. "You chose a stranger's life over your own security. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" "I didn't think about it that way," Ethan said. "I just heard the siren. I knew what it meant." Evelyn looked at him, truly seeing him. I know about your past, Ethan. I know you were a lead dispatcher. I know why you left. And I know what happened on that site today. Miller, he's a man who follows rules because he's too small to understand principles. She nodded to Sarah, who opened a leather-bound folder. Mr. Cole, Sarah began, as of this moment, your termination has been struck from the record, but you aren't going back to that intersection. Vance Global is creating a new division, the Emergency Logistics and Safety Oversight Bureau. We need someone who can see the big picture, someone who can train our crews to prioritize life over logistics. We want you as the director, with a salary that reflects the lives you're going to save. Ethan was speechless. The numbers on the paper Sarah showed him were more than he had earned in the last 3 years combined. It meant a college fund for Max. It meant a house with a yard. It meant safety. I don't know what to say, Ethan stammered. Don't say anything, Evelyn smiled. Miller has been reassigned to a remote inventory warehouse where the only thing he has to manage is boxes. He'll have plenty of rules to follow there. Your first task? I want you to rewrite our entire safety manual. I want the Ethan protocol to be the law of this city. Ethan looked at her, his eyes moist. I have one condition. I want the authority to override any supervisor on any site if there's a medical emergency. No questions asked, no fear of losing a job. Granted, Evelyn said. And Ethan, thank you. Not just for my life, but for reminding me that we build for people, not for clocks. Ethan returned to the intersection of 5th and Main the following Monday. But he wasn't wearing a dusty vest or carrying a stop sign. He arrived in a vehicle marked with the Vance Global Executive Seal. The atmosphere on the site had shifted. The workers, the same men who had looked at their boots when Ethan was fired, now stood taller. They saw him not as a cautionary tale, but as a beacon. The Ethan Protocol was officially signed into city law that afternoon. It was simple. The moment an emergency siren is detected within a half-mile radius, all construction noise must cease. All heavy machinery must move to pre-designated safety pockets. A clear lane must be maintained at all times. Failure to comply wasn't just a violation, it was a crime. But the real change wasn't in the laws, it was in the culture. The city began to breathe differently. People stopped seeing traffic as an obstacle and started seeing it as a shared responsibility. Max didn't have to wait on the stone steps anymore. Ethan was always there, often arriving 10 minutes early. He would pick Max up, and they would go get that ice cream he had promised. Ethan told his son the rest of the story, not about knights and dragons, but about real courage. He taught Max that sometimes the world will tell you to stay behind the line, but your heart will tell you to cross it, and you must always, always listen to your heart. Evelyn Vance made a full recovery. She became the city's biggest advocate for human-first infrastructure. She and Ethan remained close, a bond forged in that desperate heartbeat at a crowded intersection. The story of the single dad who was fired for doing the right thing went viral, spreading across the country. It reminded millions that a job is just what you do, but your character is who you are. Ethan Cole wasn't a hero because he cleared a path. He was a hero because he was willing to lose everything to save someone who could never thank him. He proved that doing the right thing might cost you a paycheck, but it will never cost you your soul. In a world of steel and concrete, he reminded us that the most important thing we can ever build is a way to help each other home. True heroes don't just follow the rules, they follow the heartbeat. If you believe doing the right thing takes more courage than following a title, subscribe for more stories like this and leave a comment. What would you do if the rules stood in the way of saving a life?